We focus much of our time on this podcast on B2B CX, with the occasional mention of B2C. But are there real differences between the two?
What we hear is around the consumer experience in our everyday lives, and while you can try to apply some of that to B2B, there are still differences that are in the marketplace.
Comparing the B2B and B2C worlds, and why it makes a difference in your customer experience strategy on this episode of the CX Leader Podcast.
The CX Leader Podcast with Steve Walker is produced by Walker, a business consulting firm that helps our clients unlock the potential of their customer experiences by placing the customer at the heart of all their business decisions. You can find out more at walkerinfo.com.
Hello everyone, I'm Steve Walker, Chairman and CEO of Walker Information and also the host of the CX Leader Podcast, and thank you for listening. Here on the CX Leader Podcast, we explore topics and themes to help leaders like you leverage all the benefits of their customer experience and help your customers and prospects want to do more business with you. Here at Walker, we specialize primarily in B2B companies with their customer experience, and we've spent considerable time on this podcast discussing CX from that perspective. But what about B2C? How different is the approach to CX between B2B and B2C? Some argue that the two spaces are far more similar in approach today than they have ever been. But fundamentally, there's still a significant difference between the two. To help us explore the difference between B2B and B2C is my friend and colleague Brad Harmon, Vice President of Advisory Services here at Walker, and a return guest here on the program. Brad, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
It's always great to have you on, Brad, and I know this is a topic that you've spent some time thinking about and working on, and you've actually come up with kind of a 8-point plan of where B2B is different than B2C. Do you want to just quickly run me through those 8 points, and then we can just kind of come back and explore each one of them in a little more detail?
Yeah, certainly. So a lot of things that are different. While there are similarities, the things that we see that are different tend to be around marketing. The sales process itself, the behaviors that customers exhibit, the supply or value chain that's involved in communicating with customers, the relationship management component, service and support, the use of social media, and the CX metrics that we use to predict the behaviors that customers will have.
All right, so there are your 8 there. 1, marketing, 2, sales process, 3, customer behavior, 4, supply chain, 5, relationship management, 6, service and support, 7, social media, and 8, the CX metrics. You know, you and I have both spent most of our career here dealing with B2B, but I think it would be fair to say that B2B is infinitely more complex.
Totally agree.
That you typically have multiple buyers within a solution, that you tend to have a combination of product and process or service involved.
Exactly.
And I think that a lot of our B2B CX clients have become frustrated with a lack of content around the B2B peculiarities and specialty. Is that a fair statement?
It is fair. And a lot of what we hear is around the consumer experience in our everyday lives. And while you can try to apply some of that to B2B, there are still differences that are in the marketplace.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, as since we're all consumers and we're all individuals, we all kind of default back to the consumer models because they're good examples. I think we've also explored on this program that a lot of what shows up in B2B typically shows up in B2C first.
Correct.
So, for example, you know, on-demand, website where you can kind of quickly track your package, that was something that Amazon really pioneered. But now we're starting to see that in the B2B world, similar examples.
Exactly.
So
even ordering is an example where it's second nature from a consumer standpoint, but in many B2B cases, it's still being done over the telephone or with a human interaction as opposed to something that's done electronically.
Yeah. You just even think about like the Uber, and I'm not sure that something exists like that for the airlines or some of the other transportation or even B2B shipping, I would suppose.
Yeah, correct.
So. All right, well, let's just take a rundown through each of your 8 points, and we can elaborate on this a little bit. So marketing, what's the difference between B2B and B2C marketing, Brad?
Yeah, so B2C tends to market to the millions, the masses, and really from a segment basis, whereas B2B tends to have to focus on product features, product functions, and that's done on a one-by-one basis almost, a customer by customer or person by person. And does the product and the features, does it match the needs of an organization, a company, rather than looking across numerous companies or numerous segments to create one large base? Each one has its nuances that you have to treat a little differently.
Yeah, and I think in B2C you can kind of market an image or a savoir-faire associated with a brand. And I'm not sure you can do that in B2B.
Correct. Yeah, really B2C tends to be more emotional, where you're appealing to the emotional needs that a consumer will have, whereas businesses still tend to think more rationally, more logically. And with more people being involved, it's less likely that you'll get a rash decision made by one individual. It needs to be a consensus a lot of times that's well thought out and well documented.
Yeah, and I think particularly in B2B, if you created unrealistic expectations about what the experience was going to be, you might end up doing yourself more harm than good.
That is correct, yes, most definitely.
All right, what about the sales process?
Yeah, we still see especially in large engagements, the B2B sales process can take months, if not years. When there's a large capital expenditure or something that requires a transformation of a business, that's not something that can be swapped out in a heartbeat. It really does take a lot of time. And, on the consumer side, there are much more, going back to the emotional piece, the impulse buys that happen that aren't really, well thought through.
Even for high-ticket items.
Yeah.
I mean, people, buy cars fast and
definitely
fall in love with a house and
right.
Yeah.
And also that decisions are typically not made by a single buyer. We've seen the rise of procurement be a pretty significant role in B2B situations and buying situations. But even if there is a relationship in procurement, that there are other people that are in a buying group that are involved in making a decision before it ever gets to the procurement person who may be the first point of contact outside the organization.
So B2C would tend to be a little more transactional, a little more of an impulse, whereas B2B is going to be much more strategic, much longer cycles, much more complex from a sort of a sales execution standpoint.
Exactly. And the other piece is that it's usually very fact-driven, and you have to be able
emotion.
Exactly. You have to be able to also demonstrate a return on investment or a value component to an organization, and they'll track that. And if you can't deliver upon that, then the likelihood of either building upon the relationship or renewal, if there's a renewal component, is much less likely if you can't demonstrate that ROI.
Yeah, that's a really good point because we don't really set out in our personal lives to get a return on our couch.
Right.
But, a business would purchase software and expect to realize some savings from that, for example.
Yes, exactly.
Let's go to customer behavior.
Yeah, so in B2C, a lot of consumers, especially fast-moving goods, you can predict the buying behaviors. If you think about laundry detergent or milk or bread, those kinds of fast-moving items, people are on a routine and a rhythm with those. Whereas in B2B, the buying patterns are much more difficult to discern because you can be expanding your operations and be then performing at a level that will be satisfied for 3-5 years with incremental spend. But it's difficult to determine when the next renewal point or expansion point will be. And that can make tying behaviors to metrics much more challenging, much more difficult, because there's usually a longer lag period between an experience and then a decision that's made as a function of that experience.
Yeah, so if a consumer gets brand loyal to a fast-moving product, you can almost predict the rate at which they're going to repurchase that.
Exactly, yep.
I guess maybe the recurring revenue model is somewhat like that, but
it's moving that way, definitely.
Yeah.
The subscription-based, the software as a service approach is an attempt to try to streamline that and make it more predictable. But that's a segment of the entire B2B universe. It's only a portion of it. It hasn't taken hold everywhere yet.
Correct. And as you were mentioning earlier, like a big capital purchase, the cycle on that could be a decade or more. Mm-hmm. So,
yep.
Kind of related to that, what about the supply chain?
Yeah, so in the B2B world, there can be a number of components or links in that chain where a manufacturer may make only one piece of a larger equipment or one portion of a solution that will ultimately be marketed to a business. And so the need to be able to collaborate and cooperate and share information throughout the value chain about a customer makes it that much more difficult to manage and to be able to know where things stand.
Are you one of the 10,000 people planning to attend the Qualtrics X4 Summit in Salt Lake City? If so, you'll want to catch Steve Walker's breakout session, which focuses specifically on B2B customer experience. He'll dialogue with CX leaders from several companies and focus on how B2B CX is different and what CX leaders should be doing to develop best-in-class strategies. The event will be held March 6th and 7th. If you're planning to be there, be sure to check it out.
My guest on the podcast this week is Brad Harmon. He's a Vice President of Advisory Services here at Walker. And Brad has written extensively on the differences between B2B and B2C. And today we're having a fascinating discussion of the 8 factors that differentiate B2B from B2C. We're halfway through the list. The first 4, for those of you who are keeping track at home: marketing, sales process, customer behavior, and supply and value chain. Now let's move into sort of the other side of the 4, and let's talk about the customer relationship management aspect of it.
Yeah, so in B2B, we really see organizations tracking almost everything they can about the way a customer integrates, experiences, engages with an organization. And so there's much more formality to it. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, more fact-based, less emotion, but that leads to understanding exactly what's going on, what kinds of experiences are being had by the customer, what are they taking advantage of, what are they not, and how that then is tracked really through software, through CRM systems, so that you know what opportunities are being explored, what sales have been made, where the customer is more likely to grow, and where they're less likely to grow. And then that can be used then going back to the marketing piece to target specific campaigns, specific offers to customers on a one-by-one basis rather than looking at it from a market segment standpoint.
Yeah. So in B2C, there's not really that kind of discipline around managing that relationship on an ongoing basis because it's just part of the repurchase behaviors, correct?
Correct. And we don't often know in B2C as much information as we do about a business in a B2B environment. We may know which promotions that they're taking part in or what interests they may have, but we're not necessarily going to know every time they purchase a gallon of milk or a case of Pepsi or Coke. We don't have that kind of behavior information about them, so it's less likely for us to know exactly what's happening in terms of engagement in a B2C world.
And kind of extending on that is number 6, that typically in a B2B world there's some sort of service as part of the solution. So that creates other opportunities for the customer to experience the solution.
Yeah, business to business organizations are getting better at making the service and support experience more personalized. In a lot of ways, organizations will have someone now that's on site and managing from a service perspective, or they have a dedicated number that people can call into, or they have a dedicated set of representatives that are equipped to handle issues that arise that are specific to a customer in that environment. And they also then know what other experiences that they've had and what may be leading to their discontent if they have a service call where they're not happy. So the personalization of that is getting better, and that enables people to resolve issues more quickly and to be able to ensure that the issue gets resolved entirely. But with that goes the expectation that you will see the response to its conclusion. B2B customers do have more of a anticipation that something will be done with their feedback. if they provide feedback or if they're calling in for a case, it can't just linger out there. And because of the tracking that's necessary and that's available, it's incumbent upon B2B organizations to fully close that loop and demonstrate to customers that they're doing something, that they've tracked an issue to resolution, and that there's a closed loop process associated with it.
Just listening to you talk about the service aspect of it, I think that there's consumer applications where the service, and it tends to be sort of underwhelming. I'm thinking about like, cable, airlines, doctor's visits, where when you ask for some service, you may be sorry that you did. So.
When that actually gets to the next topic, which is social media, we see B2C, usually one of the best outlets for people to voice their concerns is through social media.
Yeah.
There isn't as much of a formal channel to get any kind of resolution to an issue, so they resort to just telling everyone that they possibly can about an issue that they've had or concern that they've had. Even if that feedback that they're giving is anonymous, can't be tracked back to an individual, the fact that it's going out to the masses is the best way that their voice can be heard. Whereas in B2B, one of the better ways of using social media feedback in B2B is not about what our customers are saying, because most likely they're not going to be voicing their concerns on social media. They have other channels in which they can reach an organization to give their feedback. But what's interesting is, a customer's customer, so the end consumer, if they're voicing concerns about in your example, a telephone provider, and they're not happy with their service, not happy with their bill, looking at social media to understand what consumers are looking for, then can give a company ideas on how they can approach their customer, which may be providing that service to the end customer, ideas to innovate, ideas to have new product features built in, that can help with the B2B relationship, but not necessarily the B2C relationship.
Then finally, what about the CX metrics? How do those differ from B2B to B2C?
So in a B2C environment, we tend to look at things, again, more in a segment level and less on an individual level. And that does tend to make metrics like NPS or overall satisfaction a little more common and effective. But in the B2B world, we tend to see that people are looking at the individual assessment of a customer. And metrics that we have seen that are more effective in predicting future behavior as well as financial performance are things like loyalty, things like overall experience, where we can really track those to the individual and to peel back some of the experiences or activities that are happening that predict those in order to know which areas we need to make changes on in our business, so that we can then communicate to customers that, hey, we're doing something about your specific feedback, and that is changing our business for the better, and you should then be seeing improvements in how we operate, how we function with you in short order. And so we tend to see a little more frequently things like loyalty or overall experience as measures relative to B2C, where we'll see things a little more like overall satisfaction or NPS.
And actually on the B2B side, it's also more of a two-way relationship too. On the B2C, it's very transaction-driven, millions of customers. So one of the things I know we talk about a lot with B2B companies is more of a value mapping type of solution. You talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. So we want to be able to look at where an individual customer falls and what matters to them. And that can differ on a customer-by-customer basis. So which levers should we push or pull in order to improve the relationship, but also to know, how valuable each of these customers are to us. We may take different actions based on the strategic fit or strategic value that a customer has to us, and we may make concessions or may do things a bit differently. Whereas if we're looking at it from a consumer perspective, we're going to look at it with a broad brush in many cases, and we're going to target thousands of individuals with any changes that we make, and we're not necessarily looking at it on a one-by-one basis.
My guest this week on the podcast is Brad Harmon, and he's just given us a great rundown of the 8 ways that B2B CX is different than B2C. And those 8 ways, again, just for reference, are marketing, the sales process, the way the customer behaves. Number 4 is the supply and value chain. Number 5 is the customer relationship management. 6 is the element of service and support. 7 is how social media impacts. And lastly, and certainly not least, is the sort of the metrics that we use to evaluate these relationships in B2B versus B2C. Hey, Brad, kind of a hallmark of our program is a little take-home value. So if I am a B2B CX practitioner out there, maybe I'm a little bit new to the space, or maybe I'm having trouble getting through to my folks the difference between B2B. Could you sort of collapse these 8 differences into maybe sort of an overall thought or some words of wisdom for somebody that's trying to make sure that their organization is taking advantage of what B2B really has to offer?
Yeah, I would say start with a customer and be able to look at what you're doing and relate that to a strategic customer. If you can demonstrate that A, you're listening to that customer, that you've got a proper representation of feedback about a customer, and that you're able to then make some change to the way in which you do business with a single customer and track what happens in that relationship and look at how it benefits you, it benefits the customer, and then build upon that. Start with, go to the next customer and the next customer and the next customer. But looking at it as building blocks and the customer being one of those building blocks, that is the best way that I have seen to really get momentum and to get clarity of what you're trying to accomplish, because you can then say that we've done this with a single customer, it's been effective, and we're making changes to our business that will impact other customers, and we track those over time.
That's great advice. I really like that as kind of the central theme. I think it ties in a lot of the 8 elements, that if you're a B2B CX practitioner, you really got to focus on what you can do at the actual account level, one customer at a time. Brad, thank you very much for being on the program. Anything else that we should have hit on that we didn't cover in this wonderful time we've spent together?
I don't think so. I think we've hit all the high points that I see as differences between B2B and B2C. And if
any of our listeners wanted to follow up, how they might get a hold of you?
Certainly. The Twitter handle is Out of Harm's Way, OUTTAHARMSWAY. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can call me, 317-843-8578. Email address is bharmon@walkerinfo.com.
Great. Thanks again, Brad. We'll hope to have you back on again sometime soon. And if you want to talk about anything else we've discussed or about how Walker can help your business customer experience, you can contact me at steve.walker@walkerinformation.com or call me here in the U.S. +1 317-843-8890. Don't hesitate to reach out, and I'd love to tell you more. And if you're planning on being at the Qualtrics X4 Summit coming up in early March, be sure to stop by and see us at the Walker booth. We're also having a pre-event CX tailgate party, and I'll also be speaking at a breakout session, so you won't want to miss either of those events. You can find a link to more information on our podcast page. Speaking of which, don't forget to subscribe to the CX Leader podcast. You can go to walkerinfo.com/podcasts, and you'll find links to iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Play, and also on our own YouTube channel as well. Simply go to walkerinfo.tv to listen. Thanks to all of you for subscribing and making the CX Leader podcast the source for CX leaders to get all the information they need to make sure their programs are just as good as they can be. Thank you for listening to this episode of the CX Leader Podcast, which is a production of Walker. We're a business consulting firm that can help you make customer experience your biggest competitive advantage. Find out more at walkerinfo.com. Thanks again for stopping by the podcast, and we'll see you next time.